In 2002, a game was released for the PlayStation 2. Well, a lot of them were, but this one in particular was called Drakan the Ancient Gates. I remember seeing it on store shelves for about a month at the time before it disappeared. Luckily, I was able to grab myself a copy before it vanished. I actually still have it in a big storage thing under my bed. I didn't know what I was getting into at the time. I just saw a cool warrior lady and a dragon and was immediately in. One thing I wouldn't learn until much later was that this game was actually a sequel. The original was Drakan Order of the Flame, which came out on PC in 1999, but I'd never seen or heard of it at the time. My family PC would definitely not have ran it back then anyway, so it's not a huge surprise that I never knew about it. But that game is another video for another time, as soon as I can actually get it to work properly, which isn't as easy as it sounds. The Ancient's Gates, by contrast, was exclusive to the PS2, an odd move at the time when PC exclusives still sold very well, but you can see several aspects of the developer's PC history and how different parts of the game work. It's a pretty surprising and technically impressive game for the time and the hardware. I thought I was getting a fun adventure with dragons, but I was surprised to actually be getting a full open-world action RPG, the earlier definition of open world, where there are several large hub zones to transition between with minimal loading within them. You play as Rin, a British-voiced, at least in the sequel, a smart-talking warrior woman who is bonded to her trusty red elder dragon companion, Arok. Starting in Surdana, the first hub area with no armor and just a dagger, you'll have to make your way through the early RPG staples, going to the tavern to see what needs fixing, killing some spiders of unusual size in some dude's basement, and earning yourself some gold so you can buy a leather armor and a weapon that doesn't suck to take on the very first story dungeon, Shadowmire. The control scheme of the game takes some getting used to. It uses tank controls with the twist of being able to hold L2 to strafe. And you can even do some things that would become much more common in later games, like somersault to the sides, backflip for extra height and distance, something that you'll need for the game's optional platforming puzzles, and even dodge roll with the strafe button held. One thing to remember, though, is that you can only strafe and roll in 4 directions, no diagonal movement. After a few hours, you can get used to how the control scheme works, but it's a bit odd compared to modern games. It's also not sure if it wants to have a use button or not, with common things that would require one, like opening doors, looting chests, and mounting your dragon happening automatically when you go near them. But certain things, like pulling levers, pushing buttons, and talking to NPCs, do actually need a button. The L1 button, which is maybe the weirdest possible choice, but it does also double as the loot vacuum button and triples as the call Arok button when you're outdoors. This is also a game where X is crouch and roll and triangle is jump, so just go with it. Drakan has a somewhat unique combat system as well. It uses directional attacks. Always one thing I remember when I think back to it, where you can press a direction on the D-pad plus square, the attack button, to do different attacks. Back and square hits behind you, left and square stabs to the left, and so on. With certain moves available with specific inputs, like back attack does an overhead swing or a jumping swing if you're using two-handed weapons, left and right do spinning slashes, and my favorite, the back forward attack, which is a stepping slash that can knock enemies down, closes gaps very quickly, and with a two-handed weapon becomes a spin attack. So Ran has quite a lot of options at her disposal in combat, which leads us to magic. It uses a gesture-based magic system where you have to sheath your weapons and hold circle to draw runes in the air with the left analog stick with the D-pad. Each spell has its own shape to memorize and is then called to your hand for casting if you have the mana. Spells are often quite strong, and your mana regenerates by itself, so it's a system worth giving a try. You'll need every advantage you can get later on. You can buy higher levels of spells as you progress, and these actually change the appearance and function of the attacks, which is cool. Fireball gains an AoE blast, lightning splits more times, Impale calls up a fancier, more sinister spike. The magic in Drakan is a pretty cool thing, and all the spells are pretty fun to use. Pro tip, by the way, use the D-pad when drawing symbols. Even though it looks like you need diagonal input, you actually don't, and the simple up, down, left, right of the D-pad is more reliable. You'll start seeing the symbols as a sequence of directions to input, which is good for speed. Extra important when 8 skeletons just spawned around you and you want to reach for the time slow spell to not get killed. You also have a grid-based inventory to carry things. It's pretty small and doesn't get upgraded throughout the game, but there's a trick to maximizing the space you have. Stuff that gets dropped in this game on the ground doesn't despawn, so just pick a nice, flat, easily accessible stretch of ground to use as storage space, and whatever you drop there will be safe. The area just outside of the Surdana blacksmith, right next to the guy making a wagon, is the most popular choice because this is an area that you can return to very easily throughout the game whenever you want. Chances are you'll be carrying armor, a few weapons, potions, and maybe some key items, so you want to keep some extra space for some sweet new stuff you might happen upon. There's also a durability system where weapons and armor will degrade with use, requiring you to go back to a blacksmith to fix them. But the real kicker in this game is that repairing something will also reduce its maximum durability by 10%, but is always cheaper than buying a new version of what you're repairing. Bows have arrows instead of durability, so they need to be reloaded instead of repaired, although strangely enough, the 10% reduction also happens to bows too. I guess the quiver gets smaller every time. On the plus side, you don't have to carry arrows in separate slots, as each bow has its own self-contained supply of the kind that it uses. As far as weapon variety goes, there's quite a lot, from short swords, long swords, bastard swords, axes, and maces of both one- and two-handed varieties, and in several materials, tons of different bows that use special arrows and enchanted weapons. Swords that can set things on fire, call up earth spikes to impale people, drain health with each strike, and some super special stuff that requires puzzle solving and the collecting of many other things until the very end of the game, like the Mornbringer. The game also uses a level system. Each level comes slowly but allows you to put a point in melee, ranged, or magic skill, and different spells and equipment have different skill level requirements to use, except for armor, which simply requires a specific level. But levels are important to gather as you go, since you don't increase your health. Your damage and survivability is entirely based on the gear that you can equip. The max level in the game is only 12, so each one counts. There's also no grinding in the game, as enemies don't respawn, and you can't return to most story dungeons after you clear them. This means exploration is extra important, since you'll need every drip of experience you can find, and some of the best equipment in the game is found from side quests and exploring out-of-the-way areas. After you complete Shadowmire, the game really starts to open up. You get access to Erok, and you can start to fly around Sardana, which is when you'll suddenly realize the scale of the game is going to be a lot more than it let on at first. Erok has breath weapons, the classic fire breath to start with, and acquires others from certain main and side quest moments. Each breath weapon actually has an alt fire as well. Fire breath shoots fireballs, as well as the classic Dragon flamethrower breath, which is better for clearing ground troops. You'll also get a Sonic Breath with a huge AoE vacuum explosion, a Lightning Breath, which is an instant hit and can also fire a Chain Lightning Orb, Ice Breath, which fires homing ice blasts that can freeze enemies, and eventually Darkness Breath late in the game, which siphons health from anything it hits and can call up an extremely powerful black hole using the whole breath meter at once. Drakan also has some really nice music, especially the exploration tracks that change for each area, and also a good use of the lack of music where it counts. Special mention goes to the Forgotten Tomb, a pitch-black crypt filled with skeletons that you have to fight in the dark, since you can't hold a torch and a weapon at the same time by watching their glowing blue eyes bob around in the completely black silence. Whispers and creepy noises give areas like that a memorable atmosphere, and the whole game has this late 90s, early 2000s appearance that I really like. That time in 3D where it wasn't the super early days, it had started to be figured out, but was still primitive compared to what would come soon after. I'd say from around 1998 to 2004 or so is this specific period in art styles, from Unreal and Half-Life, Heretic 2, basically Majora's Mask to Morrowind. This specific style lends itself to a unique type of atmosphere, and the modern throwback games are only recently starting to do it really well with games like Gloomwood and Ultrakill. The developers of this game, Surreal Software, actually used their own in-house engine, the Riot engine, to make this game, as well as the previous game, Order of the Flame, and they would then go on to use that engine to make several more games. The Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring game, which was actually pretty fun, and you might notice if you've played that game, actually looks somewhat similar to this one because of that, as well as The Suffering and The Suffering Ties That Bind. Soon, you'll head off to the Andrelian Isles, a place meant to teach you more about air combat with emplacements, aerial enemies, and clearing ground enemies while mounted. It's a short interlude with only a few quests, culminating in a boss fight against Bone Grinder. He starts off immune to damage, but after you break the eyes in the surrounding statues, he'll go down pretty quick, and you can move on now that his magic storm is cleared. After you complete the Isles, you'll head off to Ravenshold, a cold and unforgiving place, as well as the northern tundra above it. Each area introduces new enemies, and there are often areas which have enemies that are unique to that one place, making them an almost mini-boss-like unique encounter, like the portal in the tundra that leads to the horrifying ravine filled with ice golems. This is the only place you'll see them in the whole game, and you should be thankful for that. They have a vicious hit scan like eye beams that do tons of damage and can freeze you in place. This is probably a good point to say that Drakan gets pretty hard. The game is a fan of springing tough combats on you every other room. Most enemies in the second half of the game can kill you in around 4 hits, but they also tend to go down just as fast themselves. As you get farther in the game, instead of enemies getting tons more health, since your damage can usually keep up with them, they'll get more damaging attacks to go up against your improved armor and start to use new types of spells, weapons, and combos against you. This is the game, by the way, that taught me to save in multiple slots. The save system has basically no limitations. You can save in the middle of combat while being somewhere you weren't supposed to be, even in midair about to fall to your death. I'd recommend you use all 4 save slots and save often, rotating them with each save. That way, if one becomes an unwinnable situation, you have others to fall back on. That's a lesson I still use to this day, by the way. I always save in 3 or 4 slots instead of always overriding the first one, and it's all thanks to being traumatized by the restrictionless saves in this game. After the Frozen North is completed, you'll be heading off to the Valley of the Fallen in the desert beyond that. This is where things start to get pretty serious, and the game also has some sprawling, switch-finding, button-pressing, altar-locating puzzles for high-level gear in each area that continue into the desert, like the Fire Blade that's obtained by fighting a bunch of skeletons and placing 3 crystals in hard-to-find altars. It is definitely worth it in the end, by the way, to get all 4 of the elemental blades, since it gets you the best sword in the game. This is also a good place to mention that Drakan was originally going to be a little bit more than its current state. These puzzles are just one of the fragments of what once was. You'll notice that some of these puzzles are not super well explained and a little bit different than perhaps they were intended to be. That's because a lot of this stuff, especially the sprawling Sordana switch-finding puzzle and the big directional puzzle later on in the game, they're all originally what was based on something bigger. There was a little bit more planned for this game, and these puzzles are sort of like the remnants of what once was a more grand adventure. So it's interesting to speculate what could have been had that original form actually seen the light of day. After a lengthy dungeon filled with the new undead enemies, the Soulless, that remain super dangerous even once you have the game's best armor, which is luckily indestructible so you'll never have to worry about repairing it, you'll find yourself in the final area, Stratos. Stratos is where Drakan's difficulty goes from unforgiving to downright unfair at times, but the dungeons here are really memorable to go through. I was gonna have some footage here of my favorite dungeon in this area, the Flesh Mage's Palace, but unfortunately the footage got corrupted. In fact, all the incidental stuff I recorded in Stratos did get corrupted, and since all my saves are after the palace is done, I can't go back, so you'll just have to try it for yourself. But Stratos is filled with tough encounters with the hardest enemies that you'll find yet, including the Desert Lords themselves, which can teleport around and cast all sorts of powerful spells, as well as new golems, a bunch of new flying enemies, and placed turrets, and some pretty tough bosses like the Pain Elemental. It's definitely a memorable ending for the game, though, because it gets very difficult, and all of the enemies here are uniquely disturbing looking and make the whole place feel a little bit alien compared to the rest of the game. Overall, Drakan the Ancient Gates is a pretty cool experience that acts as an interesting time capsule of 2002 game design. It feels primitive enough to remember where modern third-person game design comes from, but it's also still plenty enjoyable enough to be well worth playing to experience it again, or for the first time if you've never played it before. If you've never heard of this series, I definitely recommend you take a look at it. It's a fun snapshot of early action RPG design evolution that makes for a pretty surprising adventure. You never knew what you were going to get as a kid in the 90s and the early 2000s when you grabbed something off the shelf that looked cool and would end up being an obscure sleeper hit all these years later. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.